Well, it's a great pleasure to be back in Montreal and to visit your conference once again. Dr. Devant reminded me that I spoke here in the late 90s when I was a professor at the University of British Columbia. And you have grown. You are obviously a vital force in this province, and I'm very impressed with your work and very honored to be invited back. I want to deal in this presentation with one of the troubling problems, I think, that we are struggling with in translating research to practice and research to policy. We hear every day that we should be practicing evidence-based practice. But as we look at the evidence, we often find that it doesn't fit the circumstances in which we are working, the culture in which we are practicing public health, the settings, the conditions in which we're practicing. And so we need to find ways to interpret and adapt the evidence to our practice. And my argument will be that we can do that best if we engage the research process more actively in the practice setting. And I will conclude with the observation that if we want more evidence-based practice, we need more practice-based evidence. The problem has been described as follows by Jonathan Lomas, who was the past president of the Canadian Foundation for Health Services Research. And we were both giving keynote presentations at the European Public Health Association a few years ago and in Amsterdam. And he characterized the problem for medicine and public health in communicating their research to policy as follows. Where am I? You're 30 meters above the ground in a balloon. You must be a researcher. Yes, how did you know? Because what you told me is absolutely correct, but completely useless. You must be a policymaker. Yes, how did you know? Because you don't know where you are, you don't know where you're going, and now you're blaming me. So this is the fundamental gap or chasm between research and practice, research and policy. Jonathan Lomas went on to characterize the public health system, as he has often characterized the medical care system, as living in a different world from that of the academic researchers. The academic research world, the public health system world, each in their own compartments, working on the puzzle of public health, the problems of public health, but working on different parts of the problem. So I will try to address the two big challenges as follows. Matching the evidence for public health that policymakers and practitioners need with what they are getting from our research, especially beyond clinical and behavioral, clinical to behavioral, social, and environmental change, where the evidence has to take a different form than it does in clinical medicine. And in order to address that problem or those problems effectively, we have to come to grips with some discomforting conditions of peer review and editorial tendencies that shape the research as it is delivered to us as evidence-based practices. The two biggest opportunities I see in accomplishing those challenges are to apply participatory research principles in the use of surveillance or public health surveillance methods, or evaluation of programs, and continuous quality improvement in answering the questions of practice. And finally, combining participatory research principles with multi-site evaluation methods that will lend greater external validity or generalizability of the results. If we do our studies in one setting, no matter how solid, how strong the statistical significance in that setting, it may not generalize to other settings. And that is what public health deals with every day. The most frequently quoted statement about this problem is that it takes 17 years to turn 14% of original research to the benefit of patient care. Now, the same statistic could probably also apply to public health, and the 17 years may be more. The 14% may be less. But it is a troubling statistic when you consider all that our societies are investing in research. Here's how the figures were arrived at. It's not a single study, it's the composition of multiple studies about the movement of original research ultimately to implementation. We lose about 18% of original research that's never submitted for publication, usually because the authors of the original study decide that they got negative results, and there's a strong bias by editors against negative results. When in fact, negative results would be particularly helpful to practitioners who are struggling with the decision about what parts of their program to maintain in public health. We lose another 46% between submission and acceptance. Much of that because of problems with the numbers, design issues in the studies. And then between acceptance and publication, we don't lose anything, because once the editor has gone to all of that work to put the manuscripts through peer review, they're not going to let it get away if it achieves acceptance. We lose about 35% between publication and bibliographic databases. And much of that, again, because they don't meet the standards for cataloging the data for purposes of systematic reviews. And then we lose a lot of that, 50%, between getting it into the databases and having it systematically reviewed and put into guidelines and textbooks. And from there to implementation, actually, we don't lose any, but it takes a long time. Here are the time lapses between these phases. About a half a year between submission and acceptance, another half a year between acceptance and publication, another third of a year between publication and bibliographic databases, 6 to 13 years between the studies arriving in these catalogs, these bibliographic databases, and their ultimate systematic review, combining individual studies with other studies to come up with guidelines and ultimately textbook references that guide students in training that this is what should be evidence-based practice. And then 9.5 years approximately between when it appears in the textbook and when all of it is ultimately implemented. Now here's the pipeline metaphor that is used to describe the movement of evidence from more basic research ultimately out to practice. We start with our priorities for research, and that opens the doors for offering funding opportunities. We put the grants through peer review processes, and we squeeze a lot of the grant applications out of the pipeline. We squeeze the pipeline more as the research is completed and it's submitted for publication. The peer review process there at work. We squeeze it some more as we synthesize the research and try to make sense of the multiple studies and whether they warrant recommendations for best practices. And finally, the guidelines themselves squeeze it further until we have this drop in the bucket of practice. But the practitioner is faced with all kinds of constraints: funding limitations, client or population needs, client or population demands, local practice or policy circumstances, professional discretion. A particular problem that I want to come back to, professional discretion. These guidelines seem to be saying, don't exercise discretion, follow these guidelines, regardless of the population you're working with. The credibility, therefore, after all of these considerations, that the practitioners attach to the recommendations. They find the recommendations to be somewhat sterile and produced in settings unlike their own, in populations unlike the one that they're working with. So where does all this come from? Well, there was the evidence-based medicine movement. Archie Cochrane in the United Kingdom trained David Sackett, who came to Canada, trained a generation or two of investigators, including Brian Haynes, who started the Journal of Evidence-Based Medicine. And then we in the United States were beginning to pay attention, and we adopted the evidence-based medicine movement and inserted it into guidelines for practice. Our politicians loved it because they could say, if it doesn't meet these standards, it shouldn't be funded. And so they used evidence-based medicine as an excuse to cut the funding for a lot of programs. So all of those potential limitations of evidence-based medicine have made it a bit suspect as we try to translate it to public health. And in public health, we have additional reasons to be concerned because a lot of what we do doesn't lend itself to the criteria of evidence-based medicine, particularly randomized controlled trials. Very often what we do on whole populations where either it is impossible to randomize, as with mass media, for example, or it may be unethical to randomize citizens to receive or not receive the intervention. The evidence-based medicine, in turn, has affected our publication priorities and peer review practices, our research syntheses, our guidelines for evidence-based practice, and it's even, of course, affected practitioners. Now, having seemed to have suggested that evidence-based medicine has not done us much good, I want to be sure you understand that I wouldn't want to take a drug that hasn't been submitted to very rigorous randomized controlled trials. I believe in evidence-based medicine. I believe it has cleared a lot of things out of medicine that were being practiced for decades without much evidence. Traditional practices that needed to be moved out of medicine to make room for evidence-based practices. Now, in addition, the academic appointments, promotion, and tenure processes have added to this process, which in turn has been affected by the evidence-based medicine culture, and that in turn is affecting peer review of grants. It's affecting publication priorities and peer review. And now we have this additional problem of impact factor scoring. Impact factor scoring is where we put more weight on publications, on research published in high-impact journals. Those are the journals that are most frequently cited by other researchers. So note well that it is not social impact that impact factor scoring is measuring. It is academic impact. How many other researchers like you are quoting your work? And so impact factor scoring in turn has affected research priorities, the academic appointment and promotion and tenure criteria, where a committee sits down with your dossier after you have struggled for 6 years as an assistant professor and counts the number of publications and then recounts those that are in high impact factor journals. And that becomes the driving force on who gets promoted from assistant professor to associate professor. And finally, this two-way relationship between publication priorities, peer review, and impact factor scoring. The editors of journals themselves are looking at impact factors of their journal to satisfy their publisher and themselves and their associations, and are even putting pressure on, in some cases, on the authors to put more citations to their own journal in their publications. So it's all a bit distorted as a result of many of these trends. And the peer review of grants is affected as well. So with all of this, when we produce evidence out of academic research, and we see that it's not being applied by practitioners, we say that the practitioners are not doing their job well. We blame the practitioners, or we blame our failures of disseminating the research more effectively. I'm personally doubtful that dissemination is the problem. If anything, we have more dissemination than most of us can manage. When you think of all of the new media, the efficiency of our dissemination potential, I mean, ever since smoke signals, we have done nothing but increase the efficiency of communications. And if anything, the practitioner is overwhelmed with the evidence, not underwhelmed. So blaming dissemination is probably not getting us very far, although a lot of research is now being addressed to dissemination. It's probably mostly problems of implementation and problems of the fit of the evidence with the practice in which the practitioner is faced with trying to apply the evidence. Another agency in the US that has struggled with this problem, because it has the responsibility for translation of research to practice, is the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Carolyn Clancy, who was director of that agency, characterized it as follows. We have practice on the left and where we want it to be on the right, and we have this gap or chasm between them. And so we fill it with translation of research into practice, their initiative that involved annual conferences, diffusion, dissemination of the research, education of practitioners, assistance in adopting the practices, implementation of the practices, moving barriers to implementation, and innovations in how to do all of those things. So all of this assumes that the evidence is right for every setting, and that what we need to do is educate practitioners and train them and support them in applying the evidence. It is a little reminiscent of the fallacy of the empty vessel from early health education. In the 60s and before, we were very enamored with the mass media. And so we were pouring information out to the public. And an anthropologist came along, Stephen Polgar, and said, you public health educators are essentially committing a fallacy of the empty vessel. You assume that the public is an empty vessel, and all you have to do is pour information into that empty vessel, and public health practices will follow. So there's the empty vessel. We translate it to this pipeline, and we forget that it's not empty. The practitioners have all of these other considerations that they have to grapple with and they have to work through in reconciling the evidence to their practice. The U.S. National Institutes of Health started to grapple with this problem in the late 90s, and Elias Zerhouni, who was the director of NIH at the time, created what he called the Roadmap Initiative, published in Science in 2003, translating discoveries into health. T1 was getting basic science into applied science, human clinical research, and this was particularly in response to the pressure that the pharmaceutical industry was putting on Congress to get more basic research done by NIH, because that was what was producing the data they needed to take drugs to market, to do the randomized controlled trials and take the drugs to market. The roadmap identifies the most compelling opportunities in 3 arenas: new pathways to discovery, research teams of the future, and re-engineering the clinical research enterprise. It was suggested that public health was the roadmap less traveled. And Jack Westphal took a look at practice-based research and found that there were opportunities that we were missing. He called these the blue highways on the NIH roadmap. You know how roadmaps have red highways, the superhighways, and blue roads, which are the less traveled roads. The Canadian Task Force on the Periodic Health Examination was one of the first to really take evidence-based practices and translate them to what we need to do in practice for prevention with the periodic health examination. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, on which I served in the 1980s, borrowed most of the criteria and standards that the Canadian Task Force had developed for review of the evidence, and the Cochrane collaboration and the NICE initiative in the UK have further refined and adopted these criteria. The Community Preventive Services Task Force in the US, out of CDC, and the Cochrane Collaboration on Public Health have further adapted these criteria to public health. And then on the T3 side, on dissemination research and implementation research, we have program evaluation, continuous quality improvement, CQI, policy analysis, evidence-based practice adaptation, and systems research. All of these are beginning to help us make sense of how the evidence fits with our practices. Well, in public health, we have a growing understanding of the determinants of health and ways in which we can intervene upon them. These determinants of health, particularly the social determinants of health and many of the behavioral determinants of health, do not lend themselves well to randomized controlled trials. In all of these, we are faced with the context of practice, and the circumstances in which practice is conducted, and the population variations, the multitude of variations across communities and populations. But as we move toward research, we have to try to control away the contextual factors. We exercise control in randomized controlled trials in order to minimize the confounding variables in the context. And so we intervene, we test our interventions by comparison with a control condition. We then look for mediating variables out of theory and out of previous research that might explain how the intervention can be expected to affect outcomes, change in outcome variables between experimental and control groups. The problems are on the intervention side that they are highly standardized. The interventions are reduced to very simplistic forms in order to be able to isolate the effectual factor. Everything else is held constant or ignored, all those contextual variables. The clients are randomized. They don't have any choice in whether they accept or not accept the intervention. They, in fact, exercise such choice, but they're assumed to have used the intervention, applied the intervention. Interventionists have no discretion in adapting the intervention to the individual characteristics of people or populations. And the populations are typically unrepresentative. They are ones that are in the clinics of or the communities of the academic setting that is producing the research. And so with those interventionists, we have highly trained research assistants, usually graduate students, and they're highly supervised, where they are not allowed to exercise any discretion in adapting the intervention to the individual or the community. On the other side, we are faced with comparisons based on averages. I lost my view of the slides here. We look for changes on the average of experimental and control groups. And it's the averages that ignore the variation between the groups. The subgroup analyses are discouraged. They fell into disrepute when we conducted some very large and expensive trials in North America, and when we realized we weren't getting the results on the average between populations, we assumed it was a problem of the intervention, or that the intervention was affecting different people in different ways. So we started doing subgroup analyses, and the statisticians wailed at that and said, you can't do subgroup analyses because the subgroups were not randomized. So dropouts in most studies are discounted or ignored. The cutoff date for outcomes are often too soon for change to have occurred. And the context is largely ignored. And when it is obviously important, it's often undescribed. Well, those then are all of the limitations of the randomized controlled trial for purposes of generalizing to our practice. And they are more problematic in public health because of the wide variation of the people on whom we're intervening. With an individual patient, you can get around some of these problems, but with a whole population, you are faced with the necessity of exercising a good deal more discretion. Context, therefore, inevitably comes back into play. The number one complaint from practitioners, according to Philip Rothwell, who did a study of practitioners about their use of evidence, is that the lack of consideration of external validity, that is, generalizability, is the most frequent complaint about systematic reviews and guidelines. And so Russell Glasgow and I undertook to try to analyze what should be the corresponding criteria for external validity that should be used together with internal validity, that is, the certainty of the effect on the population in which the study was conducted. External validity is the generalizability of that effect across other populations. We've seen that reviews of the literature, particularly in behavioral sciences, has found that what's good for scientists is not necessarily good for science. Leveraging chance by running many low-powered studies rather than a few high-powered studies, uncritically dismissing failed studies as pilot tests or because of methodological flaws, but uncritically accepting successful studies as methodologically sound. Well, I don't want to belabor all of these problems of the literature as it has accumulated, but I think I've given you a sense of caution, not a dismissal of all of this evidence, but caution in expecting it to apply equally to your setting as it did in the setting in which the studies were done. When I was at CDC, we finally got NIH together with the Agency for Healthcare Quality and Research to discuss these problems, and we produced a series of articles on limitations of randomized controlled trials in evaluating population-based health interventions, some alternative studies and the trade-offs between internal validity and external validity, for example, in exercising alternatives to the randomized trial, and particular studies that we think are most helpful in public health, particularly the multiple baseline design in which you can use surveillance systems to track changes over time. One example, I think, of how we have created a monster is the Canadian Cancer Society's request for proposals, RFP, for a review to answer 4 questions. They were ready to commit to mounting a national smoking cessation program, but they wanted to know, are group counseling programs for smoking cessation effective? If so, what's the optional content of sessions? What's the optimal number of and frequency of sessions that should be offered? And what are the characteristics of the most effective facilitators? The University of Waterloo won the contract and did a very systematic review of the literally thousands of randomized controlled trials that had been done by then on smoking cessation. And over 40 years of published and unpublished studies, thousands, they found the usual deficiencies of purpose and sampling and design and reporting. But the research, after all of those studies, could answer only the first of the 4 questions, that group programs for smoking cessation are effective. But they couldn't answer the questions about how many sessions, what kind of facilitator for the sessions, and so forth. So that and other things has driven us back to public health data. And probably the most compelling example comes from the great public health success story in Canada and the US of the last third of the 20th century, tobacco control. And in the US, tobacco control was limping along at about 1.5% per year reduction in the prevalence of smoking. All 50 states, California and Massachusetts included. And then in 1988, California passed a referendum that raised the taxes on smoking, on cigarettes, and devoted a large proportion of that tax revenue to a comprehensive tobacco control program. So in the following years, 90 to 92, The other 48 states were still moving along slowly at 1.5% per year reduction. California by now was doubling that rate of reduction. Massachusetts had not yet passed a law, and they were still at the same rate as the rest of the 48 states. In the subsequent years, after Massachusetts passed their law with an even higher tax on an even larger percentage of it devoted to a comprehensive tobacco control program, California by now was tripling the rate of the other 48 states, and Massachusetts was quadrupling the rate of the other 48 states. Now, California and Massachusetts were not randomized. California and Massachusetts are not like all the other states, and so the other 48 states, I'm now at a period in history when I'm at CDC, and the other 48 states are saying, look, we're not California and we're not Massachusetts, but what the hell did they do to get those results? And we produced at that time then a document called Best Practices in Tobacco Control, in Comprehensive Tobacco Control. And it became one of the all-time bestsellers of CDC documents. The other 48 states were under pressure to justify the settlement money they were getting from the tobacco industry, and they wanted to know how to replicate what California and Massachusetts had done. So my point in this story is to suggest that if we can take from real practice in real states and communities and provinces with real people, real practitioners, we have better evidence in many ways, or at least very complementary evidence to the randomized controlled trials that should guide practice. The Institute of Medicine in the US has followed this example extensively with a series of reports on the obesity epidemic and how we need to bridge the evidence gap in obesity control. Because we have very clearly an epidemic in North America, in Europe, and in the rest of the world now. But we don't have very good evidence of the randomized controlled trial type on what works to control weight in populations. And so the first of this series, called Bridging the Evidence Gap in Obesity Prevention, was a committee in which we came to the conclusion that most of the evidence has a narrow focus. It lacks attention to the larger system context. Most of it is lacking in detail of the implementation process. This is a part of the publishing problem, where detail about the intervention is discouraged in favor of detail about the data analysis. Lack of relevance to the real world, and many of the studies focus on one intervention, but obesity necessarily is going to require multiple interventions, a combination of interventions. In fact, when you test any one intervention, it will prove to be ineffective, but it becomes an essential component of a more complex, comprehensive program. The IOM committee concluded that the current evidence lacks the power to set a clear direction for obesity prevention across a range of target populations. It lacks evidence for effectiveness, seen as a lack of effectiveness by the practitioners. If you can't demonstrate conclusively that it was effective, you have to assume it was ineffective. Well, that just isn't so. Lack of demonstrated effectiveness may just be a problem in how we've gone about trying to measure effectiveness. It's difficult to fund, conduct, and publish research on community, environmental, and policy-based obesity prevention initiatives, and assessing or reporting on generalizability of research results to other populations or settings has not been given priority. That's the external validity problem. So I won't go into the ways in which these conclusions have been massaged through a series of analyses, but the latest of this trilogy, the 3 reports from the Institute of Medicine, is Evaluating Obesity Prevention Efforts, a Plan for Measuring Progress. And in this report, I think we come finally to some very clear recommendations to public health about what to do, what needs to be done as we try to evaluate what is working in real time with real practices in real populations. So we have various types of community-engaged evidence: participatory research evidence, surveillance evidence, population diagnostic evidence, program evaluation evidence. And those are the tools that we need to bring to bear in public health practice to complement what is being done in the more controlled academic research that we have depended perhaps too heavily on. In a systematic review of 24 studies that asked over 2,000 policymakers what facilitated or prevented their use of research, the number one facilitator was personal contact between researchers and policymakers. The number one barrier was the absence of personal contact between researchers and policymakers. We've got to get these communities together. I've made reference to highly controlled academic research. I've made reference to community-based research, participatory research, community-based participatory research, which is participatory research conducted with the residents of a community, and practice-based research. Now, these are overlapping categories. They're not mutually exclusive. They can be done in various combinations. But I'm speaking to you today particularly about practice-based research and, where possible, participatory practice-based research, because it is the participation of the researchers and the practitioners that will facilitate the application of the results. So we end up with two paradoxes: the internal validity, external validity paradox, which suggests that the more rigorously controlled a study testing the efficacy of an intervention, the less reality-based it may become. So it can't be taken to scale or generalized with assurance of applicability to other settings. And then there is the specificity generalizability paradox. The more relevant and particular to the local context, the less generalizable to other contexts. And so for the second one, I think, for the first one, obviously, I'm suggesting we need more practice-based evidence. For the second one, I think we need to find ways to replicate, or at least do comparable studies across settings that will allow us to make the comparisons for generalizability. Participatory research has seen a tremendous upswing in publications in recent years. If we care about what the population perspective is, and we must in public health, we need to recognize that the professional and scientific lens puts particular focus on the objective indicators of health. The lay lens, the lens of the lay person, puts particular focus on the subjective indicators. And as scientists or professionals trained scientifically, we believe that the objective indicators are more important. But if the question is behavior change in populations, then the subjective indicators become more important. So we've got to balance those. We want to close the gap between actual needs as we measure them, and I put quotation marks around it, people's perceived needs and priorities, and the perception of policymakers with respect to resources, feasibility, and policy. And it is where these three overlap, where we have the greatest potential for action. So the task is to increase the area A in which we can hope for action by getting these circles, these spheres, more convergent. We get the northwest circle further east through public health education, getting people to perceive needs in accordance with what we have studied the needs to be. We get the actual needs as we measure them more in accordance with the public's perception through participatory research. And we get advocacy for regulation and organizational development, moving the southern circle north through regulatory strategies, advocacy, and so forth. This evidence triangle summarizes what we have suggested in all of the foregoing slides, and it's published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, 2012. So we come back finally to Jonathan Lomas's analysis of the research world and the academic research world and the public health system world, and the need to get them out of their separate offices at the table together to solve public health puzzles together. Now, he put a third person at this table, sitting in the background there, looks like he's falling asleep. This is what Jonathan called the knowledge broker. And it was a great experiment and very popularly acclaimed, but I think it fell on hard times when budget cuts came along, and the knowledge broker was becoming a substitute for real communication between the researchers and the practitioners. And so I conclude with the notion that participatory approaches at the front end of the research pipeline is the best assurance of relevant and utilized research at the other end of the pipeline. If we want more evidence-based practice, we need more practice-based evidence. Thank you very much.